Marcus Aurelius is usually presented as the ideal mind under pressure, a ruler surrounded by war, disease, and instability, yet internally composed, disciplined, almost untouched by chaos. His writing feels controlled, deliberate, stripped of excess. He reminds himself not to be disturbed, not to react impulsively, not to let external events dictate his inner state. That restraint is exactly what makes him compelling. It looks like mastery. You're no longer dragged around by circumstances. You are steady, self-contained, resistant to emotional swings. You do what needs to be done without being overwhelmed by it. In a world that constantly provokes reaction, the kind of calm feels like the highest form of strength. But the problem begins when that calm becomes the standard for how you should relate to everything. Because Marcus Aurelius is not just describing a useful discipline. He is prescribing a way of experiencing the world that systematically reduces emotional intensity. The goal is not simply to avoid destructive reactions, but to minimize disturbance altogether. You are meant to see events as neutral, to strip them of the meanings that generate strong feelings, to treat loss, pain, and even injustice as things that do not truly harm you at the level that matters. That move creates stability, but it also creates distance, because emotions are not just disruptions. They're signals. They tell you what matters, what requires attention, what should not be ignored. When you train yourself to flatten those signals, to reinterpret them as judgments that can be corrected, you gain control, but you also risk losing sensitivity to the very things that give your actions weight. This is where the philosophy begins to shift from discipline into detachment. You start to see your reactions as errors to be corrected rather than responses to be understood. Anger becomes something to suppress rather than something to examine. Grief becomes something to manage rather than something to fully experience. Concern becomes something to regulate rather than something that might be justified. At first, this feels like maturity. You're not overreacting. You're not being controlled by emotion. You're stable in situations where others would lose control. But over time, that stability can become a kind of narrowing. The range of what you allow yourself to feel becomes smaller, more controlled, more filtered through the lens of what is considered rational or acceptable within the system. And that has consequences, because some situations are not neutral. Some events are not just external occurrences that can be dismissed as indifferent. They involve real harm, real stakes, real reasons to feel strongly. If your framework encourages you to reinterpret those situations in a way that minimizes their emotional impact, you may respond with less urgency than the situation actually requires. This is where calm can become a limitation. Not because calm is wrong, but because it can be applied too broadly. There's a difference between not being overwhelmed and not being fully engaged. Marcus Aurelius tends to collapse that distinction. He treats disturbance as something to eliminate, rather than something to regulate. The ideal becomes a state where external events do not significantly affect your internal condition. That ideal is difficult to reconcile with certain forms of action, because strong action often depends on strong valuation. You act decisively when something matters enough to move you. You intervene when the situation demands it. You commit when the stakes are real. If your emotional response is consistently moderated to the point where nothing feels urgent, your capacity to respond with intensity may also diminish. This does not mean you become passive, but your engagement can become more distant. You do what is required, but without the same level of investment. You act, but with a kind of detachment that reduces the force behind your actions. And while that can protect you from instability, it can also limit your ability to fully respond to situations that are not neutral and should not be treated as such. There's also a deeper tension in how Marcus Aurelius frames control. He emphasizes that your judgments are within your control, while external events are not. This distinction is useful. It prevents you from wasting energy on things you cannot change. But it also encourages a shift of focus away from the external world and toward internal management. You become more concerned with regulating your response, than with altering the conditions that produce that response. This can subtly change your priorities. Instead of asking what should be done about a situation, you ask how you should feel about it. Instead of focusing on changing outcomes, you focus on maintaining inner stability. And while both matter, the balance can tilt too far inward. You become highly skilled at managing yourself, but less oriented toward shaping the world around you. This is where the calm begins to carry a cost. It protects your inner state, but it can reduce your sensitivity to what deserves a stronger reaction. It keeps you composed, but it can also keep you slightly removed. It gives you control, but at the risk of narrowing the range of responses you consider appropriate. That is the tension at the center of Marcus Aurelius' philosophy. It offers a powerful form of stability, but it does so by redefining how much the world is allowed to matter to you. Once you try to live with that level of composure as a constant standard, the difficulty is not simply emotional restraint. It becomes a question of what kind of engagement you're allowing yourself to have with the world at all. Because Marcus Aurelius is not only asking you to control your reactions, he is asking you to reinterpret the meaning of events so that strong reactions do not arise in the first place. That shift is more radical than it first appears. It moves the problem from regulation to perception. Instead of feeling something strongly and then managing it, you are encouraged to see the situation in a way that prevents the intensity from forming. You remind yourself that events are indifferent, that loss is part of nature, that what happens externally does not touch your inner character. These reframings are effective. They work. They reduce emotional disturbance. But they also reshape what registers as significant. Because meaning is not something separate from emotion. The way something feels is part of how it matters. When you consistently reinterpret situations to reduce their emotional impact, you are not just becoming calmer. You are recalibrating what counts as important. Over time, fewer things cross the threshold that would normally provoke urgency, anger, or deep concern. This is where the philosophy begins to compress your responses. Not in an obvious way, but gradually. You still recognize events. You still understand them intellectually. But the felt weight of those events is lighter, more contained, more distant. And that distance can become a problem in situations where full engagement is required. Because some forms of action depend on more than clarity. They depend on intensity. When something genuinely matters, the appropriate response is not always measured detachment. Sometimes it is forceful, sustained, and emotionally charged. Not uncontrolled, but not neutral either. There is a difference between being overwhelmed by emotion and being moved by it. Marcus Aurelius tends to treat both under the same category of disturbance that should be minimized. That conflation has consequences. It can lead you to underreact in situations that require a stronger stance. You maintain composure, but at the cost of urgency. You remain stable, but less responsive to the scale of what is happening. You are not shaken, but you may also not be fully mobilized. This becomes clearer in how the philosophy approaches injustice. From a Stoic perspective, external events, including harm done by others, do not ultimately damage your inner character unless you allow them to. The focus remains on your response, not on the event itself. This creates resilience. It prevents you from being consumed by anger or resentment, but it also shifts attention away from the seriousness of the injustice as something that might demand a more forceful reaction. If the primary goal is to remain undisturbed, then the intensity of your response is always moderated, even when the situation itself might justify something stronger. This does not mean Marcus Aurelius would deny the need for action. He recognizes duty, responsibility, and the role you have to play in the world. But the emotional tone attached to that action is consistently reduced. You act because it is right, not because you feel compelled by the weight of the situation. You intervene, but without the kind of emotional force that often drives sustained effort. That distinction matters over time, because sustained effort is not purely rational. It is supported by a sense of importance that goes beyond abstract duty. It is reinforced by feeling, by investment, by a recognition that something is at stake in a way that matters to you. If that sense is consistently moderated, your ability to persist under difficulty can also be affected. You become consistent, but less driven. You continue to act, but with a kind of evenness that does not scale with the seriousness of the situation. Everything is approached with the same level of calm, the same degree of detachment. And while that prevents extremes, it also flattens the range of responses that might be appropriate. There's also a structural issue in how the philosophy defines control. By placing nearly all emphasis on what is internal, it narrows the scope of what is treated as meaningful effort. External change becomes secondary, something that may or may not occur, but is not central to your sense of success. What matters is whether you maintain the correct internal state while acting. This can subtly shift your orientation. You begin to measure yourself by composure rather than by impact. You evaluate your actions based on whether you remained calm, rather than whether the outcome justified stronger engagement. And over time, that can lead to a kind of inward optimization, where the quality of your inner state takes priority over the effectiveness of your response in the world. That is not always a problem. In situations where outcomes are genuinely beyond your control, this focus is stabilizing. It prevents frustration, preserves clarity, and allows you to continue acting without being overwhelmed. But in situations where outcomes can be influenced, even partially, this inward focus can reduce the pressure to push further. You accept limits more quickly. You adjust rather than persist. You maintain equilibrium, but potentially at the cost of change. This is where the philosophy reveals its bias. It is optimized for endurance, for maintaining stability under pressure, for surviving conditions that cannot be easily altered, but is less equipped for situations that require transformation, disruption, or sustained resistance against what exists. It helps you bear reality, but not always reshape it. And when you apply it as a general approach, that bias becomes more visible. You become very good at not being shaken, but less inclined to shake anything yourself. At this point, the issue becomes clearer if you stop thinking of Stoic calm as a virtue in isolation and start treating it as a trade-off. What Marcus Aurelius achieves with remarkable precision is emotional stability under pressure. But he achieves it by systematically lowering the degree to which external events are allowed to affect him. That exchange is not neutral. It protects one dimension of experience while compressing another. The benefit is obvious. You are not easily shaken. You can function under stress. You do not collapse when circumstances turn against you. You maintain clarity where others lose it. In extreme conditions, this is not just useful, it is often necessary. Without that kind of internal discipline, you become reactive, scattered, and ineffective. But the cost becomes visible when you apply the same standard outside of extreme conditions. Because most of life is not a crisis to be endured. It is a field of choices where the degree of your engagement matters. And engagement is not just about acting. It is about how much something registers as important to you. When that sense of importance is consistently moderated, your relationship to what you are doing begins to change. You remain consistent, but less invested. You do what is required, but the depth of involvement is reduced. You are present, but not fully absorbed. There's always a layer of distance, a reminder that this, too, is something you should not be overly affected by. And while that protects you from volatility, it also limits the extent to which anything can genuinely matter. This is where calm becomes a constraint. Not because calm is inherently limiting, but because of how broadly it is applied. Marcus Aurelius does not just recommend calm in moments of excess. He treats it as the default stance toward all external events. The result is a kind of uniformity in response, where different situations are processed through the same filter of detachment. That uniformity is stable, but it is not always appropriate. Some situations require escalation. Some require strong emotional commitment. Some require a willingness to be affected, to let the significance of what is happening register fully so that your response matches it. If every situation is approached with the same level of restraint, you risk under-responding precisely where a stronger response is justified. There is also a deeper issue in how the philosophy defines strength. In the Stoic framework, strength is the ability to remain unchanged by external events. You do not allow yourself to be disturbed. You maintain control over your internal state regardless of what happens. But this definition assumes that being affected is a weakness rather than a necessary part of engagement. That assumption does not always hold. Being affected is often what allows you to recognize what matters. It is what gives weight to your decisions. It is what sustains effort over time. If you remove that dimension entirely, you may preserve control, but you also reduce the force behind your actions. You become resilient, but less responsive. This creates a kind of imbalance. You are highly capable of enduring, but less oriented toward transforming. You can withstand pressure, but you are less inclined to apply it. You maintain internal order, but the external world remains largely as it is, except for the limited ways in which your role requires you to act. Marcus Aurelius himself operated within a structure where his responsibilities were defined. He governed because he had to. He acted because his position demanded it. In that context, Stoicism helps him perform without being overwhelmed. But when that framework is generalized beyond such roles, its limitations become more apparent. Not everyone is operating within a fixed duty that dictates their actions. Many situations require you to define your own direction, to decide what matters enough to pursue, to commit to outcomes that are not guaranteed. In those cases, the absence of strong emotional investment can make it harder to sustain effort. You remain balanced, but not necessarily driven. This is where the philosophy begins to feel incomplete. It offers a powerful way to manage yourself, but a less complete way to engage with the world. It ensures that you're not destabilized by events, but it does not fully account for how you should respond when those events require more than stability. It protects you from excess, but it can also limit intensity. The more complete position is not to reject Stoic calm, but to limit its scope. Calm is most valuable when it prevents you from being overwhelmed, when it creates space for clear thinking, when it allows you to act without losing control. But it should not eliminate the capacity to be fully affected when the situation calls for it. It should regulate emotion, not flatten it. That distinction is critical, because the goal is not to feel less, but to feel in proportion to what is happening. To remain stable without becoming distant. To maintain control without reducing the significance of what you are engaging with. Marcus Aurelius gives you one side of that balance with exceptional clarity. But when that side becomes the whole, the result is a form of calm that is stable, disciplined, and admirable, yet quietly limiting in how deeply it allows you to engage with the world. And that is why the calm becomes the problem.